So I want to see if you've learned your lesson. Good evening.
Indeed. Good evening, and thank you to all of you for being here. Chris, it's an honor to get to spend some time with you. I think we have a few things to talk about.
We do have a few things to talk about. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming today, and Lauren, thank you for those really kind words.
You know, you come both as a journalist and a historian. You've got this book, which you should all buy, make sure that you read. But you also have a perspective over time, over history, and when we talk about this moment, when we talk about Trump and others, it's interesting to me because you'll hear people bring up other times, the rise and reign of Andrew Jackson, America in the 1850s, America in the 1930s. All kinds of things get thrown about. I personally, if I heard the word unprecedented one more time in this election or historical, do you really feel as though we're in a different place, or do you feel as though there are call-outs to history that inform where we are now?
Well, as old as I may seem, and as long as I've been around, I can't speak really firsthand about Andrew Jackson in the 1820s or the 1850s. I can speak very much in my lifetime. It's a very, I'm not going to use the words that you hate. It's an extraordinary time, and a time, I think, for legitimate concern. And, you know, in fairness to Trump, he's not coming in under false colors. He made it very clear how he wanted, what his administration would be, how he intended to govern. And what we have seen in just over 2 weeks, which is very long, as he's been racing to name his cabinet and other members of his administration, is that he's true to his word. And it's going to be a bumpy ride.
I think a lot of people have been prepared for a very long week, lawsuits, all kinds of things. They were surprised by the swiftness of the results, the wide swath of different people who came towards him. And I'm sure from the coffee shop to the newsroom, people have asked you your theory of the case, which I think the question somewhat boils down to, did people go towards him, away from her? Could anyone have done this? When people say to you, Chris, what happened here? What has your answer been?
Well, I think a few things. I think certainly part of it, and I was widely quoted on election night at 5 o'clock, the first CNN exit polls came out, and one of the polls was, and this is the classic question in any election, is the country on the right track or the wrong track? Sometimes it's asked, are we headed in the right direction or the wrong direction? And the answer was 25% right track, 75% wrong track. I don't, in my experience as a journalist, I've never heard that one-sided a number, and it, as I said then, it would take a miracle for Kamala Harris to win an election if that's in fact the way people felt. She represented, and I think appropriately so, how the country was being governed at that time. She was part of the administration, the Biden-Harris administration. She was responsible for the decisions that had been made, and people wanted change. And as much as she tried to talk about a new, let's turn the page, a new way forward, I think she was unable to persuade people that she was an agent of change as opposed to mostly an agent of the status quo. And oddly enough, maybe the most devastating moment for her in the entire campaign, her short 100-day campaign, was when she was on what seemed to be a friendly venue, The View, and she was asked, what would you have done differently than Biden over these last 4 years? And she said, nothing comes to mind. That was a bad answer, and an unforgivable answer in terms of something you should have been prepared for and have had a good, strong answer, to separate yourself and say, if you're not happy with the way things are going, I'm the solution, not part of the problem. Conversely, I think that there is a tremendous support in this country, whether people want to acknowledge it or not, for Donald Trump, for disruption, for a sense of alienation from the establishment, from Washington, from the inside game, from the elites, financially, politically, and culturally, which we can talk about. But so I think in a country where people were very unhappy with the present course and really wanted change and disruption, they thought Trump was the answer and Kamala Harris was not.
You know, pollsters will look at lots of different things and they'll say that the threads of this were always there, but people do a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking and wondering, well, if so-and-so had been the candidate, if so-and-so had been the candidate, is that the right idea, that another candidate might have made a difference? Or when you looked at all the different aspects, the Democrats were in a lot of trouble for a long time. Nobody would have made a difference.
Well, I take half of your premise, and the other part is unknowable. Democrats were in a lot of trouble. I mean, one can argue whether they should have been. I mean, the economy, obviously, by most macro analyses, is doing really well. We've got 2 point whatever inflation, 4% unemployment. The stock market hits record highs every week. You know, it's a very prosperous country, but particularly for people, Trump's base, people in the lower middle class and working class, people without college educations, that's not what they feel. That's not their lived experience. And, you know, statistics mean nothing to somebody. What particularly people who feel they're struggling, whether it's going to the grocery store and a box of cereal is now $9, inflation has gone down, prices aren't rising at the rate they were, but prices haven't come down. Young people trying to buy a home feel that that's more out of reach than ever. People felt that immigration, that we all saw the pictures of people just streaming across the border without any stopping of them. During the 4 years of the Biden administration, 3 times as many, almost 8 million people came across the border illegally as compared to the Trump administration, where it was about 2 million. So, I mean, there were certainly reasons for people to be unhappy. But having said that, this is the part where it's unknowable. You know, my own view is that Biden had a very successful first 2 years, had a remarkably successful midterm election in 22, which first midterms for new presidents usually are pretty rough, and he had minimal losses in the Congress. And had he lived up to the basic promise, I think, that most people thought he made when he ran in 20, that he was going to be a bridge to a new and different Democratic Party and to the future, had he dropped out then, I think he would have been viewed as a very successful president who accomplished a lot and the most important thing in the view of a lot of people was he extracted the country from the hold of Donald Trump. But by staying on against, you know, as all of us watched and many of us winced at the way he walked and the way he talked and his what seemed to be obvious cognitive struggles, I think he made it impossible for the Democrats. I think dropping out when he did, under the circumstances that he did after that absolutely disastrous debate in June, and I'm not, at that point, clearly nobody, I don't think, could have beaten Trump on 100 days. But had there been a real primary system and had people gone through the ups and downs and seen, and there's a very extraordinarily strong Democratic bench. I could list a lot of names, so could all of you, various governors, various members of the cabinet, various senators. Do I think one of those candidates who had earned the nomination and the country had had an opportunity to get to know, I'd like to have seen that race.
I do think there's a governor that people here might have thought of. I want to talk a little bit about Trump. If you look at what he managed to do, 40% of Latinos, 30% of people of color, 20% of black men, when you hear him talk, and those who will go into the administration, they're talking mandate. We have a mandate. But mandates can be tricky things. That's saying that people are embracing you, they're embracing MAGA, more than they are pushing something else away. Is he right to see this as a mandate that they want what he has listed in terms of the MAGA agenda? Or are there pitfalls in that? That some of those people who came towards him, he still has to prove some things to them. He shouldn't assume they're all in with what he's listed.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, just as in 20 people were saying, well, did people vote for Joe Biden or did they vote against Trump? You know, I think some people will say now, well, did they really vote for Donald Trump? And a lot did, but I think a lot of them were also very dissatisfied with the current situation. Having said that, politicians generally, when they win, tend to see mandates, and although the number, his percentage of the vote, he is going to win the popular vote as well as the electoral vote, which of course he didn't in 2016. But the number, as they continue to count votes in California, is now under 50%. At the last I saw, it's 49.9%. You know, on the other hand, there were 7 swing states and he won all of them, narrowly, but he won all of them. You know, the race didn't go on for 4 days. It was called, I think, 5, 6 o'clock on Wednesday morning. You know, he ran, he made it clear how he intended to govern, and I think he's entitled to pursue that. Having said that, you know, one of the mistakes that politicians often make, successful politicians, is they overread their mandate, and I kind of think you're beginning to see that already with Trump. I mean, did people want him over a continuation of Biden policies? Yes, but did that mean nominating somebody who has been under investigation by the Justice Department and House Ethics for a couple of years for sex and drug offenses to be the Attorney General? I don't think so. Did it mean taking somebody who is a vaccine denier and has spoke in just countless ways, if you look at it, has spoken out against science? Did they vote for that? Maybe some did. I think a lot of people didn't. And, you know, we could go on and on. So, you know, I mean, we'll see. I mean, in the end, the results will be the results. People will either feel in their lived experience that their lives are better and things are calmer, and, you know, the economy, if prices aren't going down, that we're getting a hold on that the immigration flood has been turned off, that we don't have all these wars that we're involved in around the world, or they won't. Or maybe they will find that the way that Trump ends the wars, for instance in Ukraine, which perhaps is kind of an accommodation to Putin and his aggression, maybe they won't like that. I mean, we have to wait and see. But I don't think you can say that Trump came in under false colors. I mean, he was pretty clear about how he intended to run, that he intended to be, you know, a guy who says, I'm your retribution, I'm your voice. I think he made it clear he was not going to be Mr. Nice Guy this time.
There are some presidents more than others capture the zeitgeist, and you could certainly say Trump is that way. There's something about him that people who attach to him really attach to him. You've spent a lot of time thinking about Kennedy, Nixon. In 1960, many people would say the way people attached to Kennedy was something special. And I wondered, as you've watched Trump over the entire time, certainly this last year as you were thinking about Kennedy and Nixon, thinking about Kennedy and just that ability for some politicians to attach to the public, what came to mind?
Well, I wrote this book, Countdown 1960, about the Kennedy-Nixon election. I don't think that Kennedy's hold on the country was nearly as strong as Trump's. I mean, Kennedy, after the 50s, which actually were a time of considerable peace and prosperity, you know, was saying it's time for a new frontier, it's time to turn the page, that there was a need for change after 8 years of Dwight Eisenhower, who was still a very popular president. I think his popularity was over 60%. And Nixon was not a particularly prepossessing opponent, but he didn't have the kind of base emotional tie with his base, his political base that Donald Trump has. I mean, part of it was he hadn't been president for 4 years. He didn't, it seems to me, excite the same kind of emotion and I'm thinking of the word almost fealty that I think Trump does. He certainly tapped into a mood of the country, but I don't think that he had the same emotional attachment between millions of American voters and Kennedy that Trump has.
What about the bookends of the media? Kennedy, Nixon, sort of the rise of the media as a political force. Certainly that debate and the way Nixon came across made a difference versus now, where rather than a consolidation in the power, we see almost a fracturing of the media. Your sort of thoughts on the two bookends of that moment? Yeah,
so for those who may not know, one of the key sort of set pieces in my book is the first debate between presidents, which was also the first debate on television between presidents in 1960. And it was a real turning point in the campaign. Kennedy was 42, turning 43. Nixon was 47. There wasn't that big a difference in age, but Nixon had been vice president for 8 years. Kennedy had been, except for the politics side of it, had not been a big player in Washington and was seen as kind of a rich, spoiled young man. But when they appeared on that stage together in September of 1960, 70 million people watched, which was, first of all, a lot of people in a country of less than 200 million people. And it was a phenomenon. I was 13 and I remember watching it. And you know, the stature gap between the two, which was a real Nixon advantage, just disappeared in that one night. Kennedy had rested. He had a tan, even though it was in black and white. You could see that he looked really healthy. The background was sort of a gray background, and he wore a dark blue suit, and he really stood out. He also very much realized that the only audience that counted was the audience in that television camera there. So he spoke directly to the audience. Nixon, who had had a serious staph infection, he'd gotten an infection in his knee and then had suffered from the flu, was about 10 pounds underweight. His collar was hanging from his neck. He always had a problem. He had a kind of a 5 o'clock shadow. And when they offered makeup to Kennedy, he said, "No, I don't need it." And they offered it to Nixon, who really did need it, and he refused to take it. And as a result, well, as Richard J. Daley, who was the mayor of Chicago, said during the course of the debate, obviously very much a Kennedy fan, he said, "My God, they embalmed him before he died." He looked like hell. And he also treated it like a college debate and, you know, was responding to the points, but not particularly looking at the audience. At one point, when Kennedy had said something about, you know, the Democratic Party as opposed to the Republican Party, and now it was time for Nixon's to respond, he said no comment. He just gave away his time, which is unthinkable in debates. You know, the media world is just so completely different now than it was then. You know, I don't know that the media necessarily played such a huge role in that election, but you know, at that point there were really 2.5 networks, because there was CBS and NBC, and ABC really hadn't become a full network at that point. In fact, on election night, while CBS and NBC were from 7 o'clock at night all night, ABC went to entertainment programming for most of the evening and then came back to the election in the middle of the night. But that media world, which, you know, I was describing it earlier as kind of a pyramid with local stations and newspapers and a couple of national newspapers and then 2.5 networks, was a much more concentrated a force in American life and American politics. Today, it's sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom. And, you know, you've got the 3 major networks, you've got 3 cable news channels, you have countless podcasts and blogs and video blogs and, you know, all manner of things. So, you know, the country, just in general, doesn't have the same shared experience that we used to have, because somebody who watches Fox News as opposed to somebody who watches MSNBC, I mean, they're seeing 2 very different accounts of the country. And, you know, I was saying earlier, talking to some graduate students from the Fells School here at the University of Pennsylvania, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the late senator from New York, one of his famous sayings was, you know, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Well, in today's world, people have their own facts, and they have a completely different reading and understanding, not their opinions, but what they think the reality of the country is, the reality of various figures in the country, their success or their failure, their effectiveness or lack of same. So it's a completely different world.
I want to stay on that for a minute, because I mean, if I hear one more person tell me, well, I did my research, what does that mean? Including my father, where did you do your research? It's interesting to me to watch this fracturing. You know, you have announced you're leaving CNN, you're going to streaming. Hoda said she's leaving the Today Show, she's going to streaming. Ezra Klein today said he's starting a YouTube channel. We see any number of newsletters, like people are going into so many places. It's hard to remember a time when everybody watched Walter Cronkite and got the local newspaper and we were all on the same page. And people will say this is terrible, but then sometimes birth is messy and it could be leading us somewhere wonderful. What is your perspective on it?
Well, I mean, I can talk about my personal perspective, but that's less interesting, I think, than sort of my advice. People sometimes say to me, well, how should we consume the news? And I always say, either watch or read something that challenges your assumptions. That if you're a conservative, watch Fox News, but read the New York Times. If you're a liberal, watch MSNBC, but read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. You know, I kind of feel that, and I know a lot of people don't have the time or the interest in doing this, but I do it myself because it's almost like a GPS. I want to be able to see how different people read the situation and then figure out where I should be. But having heard different arguments and different accounts of things, you know, if you are getting all of your research from a media outlet that has a distinct point of view, that's your research is going to have a distinct point of view. And you know, oftentimes that's what people like. I mean, you look at cable news right now, and Fox is very much to the right, is the most successful channel. And although, interestingly enough, for both MSNBC and CNN, the audiences have cratered since the election. It's like people have just said, I don't want to watch it. Leave me alone. But, you know, generally speaking, people have wanted news that amplifies what they already think. I think that's not the right way to go about things.
Do we get bored with that eventually?
Evidently not.
Well, I mean, Lauren brought up disinformation. It's not new. At the start of the Republic, you would go out on the streets and people would have broadsheets slapped up in public places with all kinds of lies, and the men in that room would sit down and write a letter and say that's not true. Now it moves a lot faster. If we open our phones right now, we can find all kinds of things that somebody literally did make up. Do we continue to fight with this, or do people come full circle and say, I'm tired of being yanked around, and I do make my way back to something I trust, or we're through the looking glass, we don't come back?
Well, but when you say something you trust, I think the vast majority of somebody who worked at Fox for 18 years, and I'll just take them because they're the most successful, I think the audience at Fox really does trust them. And
I didn't mean Fox, I meant anybody with a Twitter account can put something up there, and because people see.
Oh, well, no, well, that's different. That's different. Although some people would say it's not so different. I do think that it is important to find news sources that have an editorial process, that frankly have some skin in the game, as we saw in the case of Fox, where they had to pay $787 million because of the disinformation about Dominion voting machines, that there's a real price to be paid when you spread information that isn't true. And that very much acts, generally speaking, and it certainly has been the case of the places that got hit with that, where they're now self-regulating. So I certainly, if I had a choice between a news organization and somebody in his pajamas in his mother's basement, I think I'd go with the news organization. But having said that, what's a news organization? I mean,
Right.
Is Fox a news organization? Is MSNBC a news organization? What do you say? I mean, you got to get your way through it. My own feeling is that I want to hear differing points of view and try to figure out what makes sense. But there are a lot of people who don't. A lot of people just want to hear what they want to hear.
They want a warm bath every day.
Yeah.
Fox has managed, in some ways like Trump, to create a culture and a mind meld with its audience. Some podcasters, Joe Rogan, clearly has done this. And you talk about the cratering ratings for MS and CNN. The Democrats in general, you hear people wondering, can they replicate what Fox has done? And you certainly hear, can we get a Rogan? And I'm like, you can't go to Target in aisle 8 and just get a Rogan. But is it replicable?
I don't know. The obvious thing would be to say yes. Why shouldn't there? This is a 50-50 country, and if he won by 1 or 2% more than she did, that means she got a hell of a lot of votes too. So, why wouldn't they? But it does seem, the fact is, for some reason, that, you go back to the end of the fairness doctrine and the rise of opinion radio on AM and the rise of Rush Limbaugh. And, now you've got Rogan. Although Rogan, I don't know how many of you listen to him. Rogan is not a hard right conservative. He certainly speaks for kind of a bros mentality and has very much built a bros audience. But he's not, I wouldn't compare him to Fox News in terms of having a coherent agenda that he's trying to sell. It's almost more a sensibility in his case, a way of viewing authority in the world. But to answer your direct question, I don't know why, but has there ever been a radio liberal Rush Limbaugh? No. Has there ever been a streaming liberal Joe Rogan? No.
Maybe it's just something not in the liberal DNA, though maybe somebody will replicate it. We will see. Quickly on the debates. Donald Trump famously this year did not do any of the primary debates. He did one with Kamala Harris.
And one with Biden.
And one with Biden. And one would say that he lost the one, many people said, with Harris, but it did not seem to matter. And I wondered, as you thought about the Kennedy-Nixon debate, is that something that we may not see anymore? We may not see debates anymore, or that they may not really matter anymore?
Well, the fact that they aren't dispositive, that it isn't what ends up deciding the election, is different than saying that they don't matter. I had the great good fortune of moderating 2 presidential debates when they were being done by the Commission on Presidential Debates, which started in 1988 and was the sole authority until this cycle. And I got to do the last debate between Clinton and Trump in 2016, and the first debate, the train wreck between Trump and Biden in 2020, where, not that I still hold a grudge, but Trump interrupted me or Biden 145 times in 90 minutes. And I recently got out of therapy about all of that. I actually thought, and it's just my opinion, I thought Trump lost the debate that I moderated in 2016, and in fact, I think, and how do you judge winning and losing? I don't know that Kennedy, interestingly enough, the Kennedy-Nixon debate, people who listened on radio thought Nixon won the debate. People who watched it on TV thought Kennedy won the debate. So winning the debate oftentimes, and I would certainly argue in the case of the first debate in 19 1960 between Kennedy and Nixon was as much, or maybe more, about cosmetics and appearance than it was, and persona, than it was about, you know, any kind of who scored more points on points of policy. You know, there's just a general impression. It seems, it feels to me like Trump's supporters don't really care. I mean, I thought the debate here was in Philadelphia, I said on the air, I thought it was a shutout. I thought that Kamala Harris just beat him on every point, but people didn't seem to care, or at least Trump supporters didn't seem to care, and it didn't seem to make that much of a difference. As to whether or not they matter when there'll be any, some people say, well, you know, have they run their course? In a world where, you know, I talked about the media and how we're all divided up and there's no shared experience. Short of the Super Bowl, presidential debates may be the single biggest attraction there is. This was a little different because it wasn't being done by the Commission on Presidential Debates. One was done by CNN and run on the other networks. The other was done by ABC and ran on the other networks. But my two debates both got over 70 million people watching them. And I think the first Biden-Trump debate got 60 million. I think the second one got 50 million. That's a heck of a big audience in today's world. Nothing gets that. The Academy Awards don't get it. The World Series doesn't get it. So there's still a real interest among the American public to see these two candidates against each other.
Throughout your history in covering politics, people have made assumptions about certain parts of the electorate. Blacks do this, Latinos do that, the working class does this, the religious do that. I think this election in many ways changed that because so many people shocked people with what they did. Is that a good thing and a recalibration of politics? I've often heard people in the Black community say, one party ignores us, the other one takes us for granted. Does this positively change that assumption model for many of these different communities in a good way?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, there obviously has been for a long time an assumption, and it was borne out by the results on Election Day, for instance, that blacks were in the Democrats' pocket. And I think Biden won 90-7, you know, with the other 3%, you know, 90% to 7% in the exit polls among black voters. And, you know, not that it changed dramatically, but young black men, there were certain elements in the black community that were voting, I think, over 20% for Trump. And, you know, I don't think any voter should be taken for granted. I think everybody should be up for grabs, and people ought to feel they need to speak to them. And, you know, what a huge wake-up call for the Democrats in this election when they suddenly saw constituencies that they thought they could completely depend on. I remember a few years ago when there was talk about the demographic time bomb and the idea that we are, and I don't know, frankly, whether we are not yet or not, but if not, we are almost there, where we're a majority-minority country. The majority of voters are not white Caucasians. And you know, there was a feeling that just meant the inevitable takeover of politics by the Democrats. Well, we now see that isn't true, and I think that's only hopeful and helpful, that, you know, you gotta earn every vote. Don't take anybody for granted.
I want to ask you a little bit about Trump Vance, his governing partner, who's much younger, a senator, more ideological in many ways than he is. In writing the book on Kennedy-Nixon and thinking about partnerships, do you have any thoughts or predictions about how this relationship is going to go?
Well, yeah, I mean, but Trump is kind of sui generis. I mean, he's different than anybody else. So let me first talk about the running mates in 1960. Henry Cabot Lodge was Nixon's running mate. He had been a former senator, in fact, beaten by Kennedy in 1950. And as senator from Massachusetts, he then became the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and had quite a distinguished career there. He was a disaster as a running mate. He liked to take a nap. He didn't like to campaign at night. he kind of went off on his own. I told you what Richard Daley said about Nixon during the debate. Well, as soon as the debate was over, Lodge, who was watching it in a room with several reporters, said, "That son of a bitch just lost the election," which isn't what you want from your running mate. The other ticket is much more interesting, and this is another one of the great set pieces in this book, because Kennedy really did not want Lyndon Johnson to be his running mate, but Johnson was a tremendous power in the Democratic Party. He was the Senate Majority Leader. He had finished second in the vote. Kennedy really wanted Texas, so, and felt he needed it, and in fact he did. And so he wanted to make an offer the day after he was nominated at the convention in LA. He wanted to make an offer to Johnson to be his running mate with the full expectation that Johnson would say no. And during the course, they were both staying in the same hotel, the Biltmore in LA, and because the reporters were camped out at the elevators, particularly on Kennedy's floor, but also on Johnson's, because he was kind of the obvious choice, they literally, Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy are running up and down the stairs from the 9th floor where Kennedy's suite was to the 7th floor where Johnson's suite was, and trying to go back and forth, and to their horror and shock. And there's a great picture in the book of that Life magazine took of Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. At one point, they're in a hotel room and they're seated like this in profile with the sun behind them, and you can tell they're really distressed. Suddenly, Johnson, who originally said no, is persuaded by some people that yes, he should take it, and he says, "Yeah, I will be I'll be your running mate." And then the Kennedys realize, "Oh my God, what have we done?" And they try to get labor leaders and other people to come and raise hell about it. And Bobby goes down and talks to Lyndon and says, "It's going to cause a huge problem with the liberals, and it's going to cause a huge problem with labor." And Johnson almost breaks into tears and says, "I really want it." And they gave it to him, and they were very unhappy about it. But in fact, part of the story in the book is rampant vote fraud in Texas that probably stole the state and gave those 24 electoral votes to John F. Kennedy for president. So they were happy with it in the end. In terms of now this president, I know that I've done selling my book a little bit. It's interesting. I remember in 2017 when Trump first came in, about 3 months after he came in, Steve Bannon, who, if you remember, was very powerful and very important in the original Trump White House. Basically, there were two chief staff people. One was the chief of staff, Reince Priebus, and the other was Steve Bannon. And Bannon was on the cover of Time magazine by himself. And I remember thinking at the time, the boss is not going to like that. And within a couple of months, Bannon was out. Trump doesn't like to share the spotlight. So my guess is you're going to see Vance. He's certainly not going to be a partner in governing. He will be used for certain things. Trump, will certainly use him. He's using him right now to try to shepherd some of these nominees through the Senate. But how big a partner was Mike Pence during those 4 years? I don't know that Vance will be substantially more. In fact, to me, one of the most interesting dramas in Washington and the national scene right now is Trump and Elon Musk, because Musk is there and he's staying at Mar-a-Lago, and he just took Trump out to Texas to watch one of his SpaceX starships go up. And Trump doesn't share the spotlight, and he may be sort of enamored of Musk, but I would say that generally one of the big issues in Washington right now is what's the over/under on how long Donald Trump puts up with Elon Musk? And I would say take the under on that bet.
I'm thinking of a different tech company, because given what he's done in the last 2 weeks, it seems as though he's living by move fast and break things. as a philosophy. I was hired to break things, to really change things. But when you talk to people in DC who are in the government, they will remind you it is a behemoth. Many, many, many layers. How much change can he actually make? I mean, clearly it seems as though they will move to bring in a lot of people who share a certain ideology, a certain point of view. How much change are we in for?
Well, as much, I mean, I don't know that I can answer it, but as much as Donald Trump can accomplish. I mean, I think you've seen it in two respects already. First of all, you've seen these nominees, a lot of whom really have shocked Republicans, and I'm talking about like Senate Republicans and House Republicans as well. And one of the sort of mad genius things about Donald Trump is one of the ways he avoids one scandal or one conflict or one controversy is to pile on more of them so that you can't really focus. I mean, just when your mind is exploding about Pete Hegseth, the weekend anchor on Fox News, being the Secretary of Defense when he's never run anything, and this is he has 2.8 million civilian and military employees. Suddenly Matt Gaetz is appointed, and then Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is appointed. So you don't quite know what to fasten on because there's a bright, shiny object here, and there's a bright, shiny object here. And it's one of the ways he deals with the media and kind of keeps people, you know, sort of like a dog. If you ever, terrible thing to admit, I have done this on occasion, taken a laser pointer and put it on the floor and the dog chases the laser light around. It's kind of, that's the way we are in the media with Trump. But there are some substantial things he's tried to do now that are breaking, in some cases, the Constitution. I mean, one of the things he is saying to the Senate is you need to go on recess and I will just appoint these people and you don't have to confirm them, and we'll treat them as recess appointments, which means they would get to stay. If they appointed them in January or February, they would get to remain as the Secretary of State, for instance, until December of 26. So basically 2 years. Well, Article 2 of the Constitution says the president shall appoint officials by the consent, advice and consent of the Senate. So if the senators go along with that, they are really, yes, recess appointments are in the Constitution, but it was written at a time when it used to take weeks to get to Washington, which, except when the TSA really breaks down, is no longer the case, you know, would be a real abdication of their responsibility. I don't think they're going to do it, but it's interesting that Trump is demanding they do it. The other thing Trump is doing, to give you a sense of how much he wants to change and break things, a lot of these people are being appointed or named without any FBI vetting at all, which is unprecedented. I mean, he's not signed an agreement with the GSA for transition, so the Trump officials are not allowed to go into the various departments that they'll be taking over. You know, he's not doing the vetting that normally is done with the FBI. He's going to try to change the system as much as he can, and I can't predict exactly, but despite, and you're quite right, Tam, that the bureaucracy is very resistant to change, and there are a lot of traditions and all of that. I think 2 years from now, if we were to sit here, we would agree that the headline was not how little things had changed, but how much things had changed.
What is the right stance for the media? You talked about the dog with the pointer. And part of what happens when you react is eventually you look hysterical. That everything he does, the media is going nuts. And you can see the exhaustion the public has, including on the left. Is it right to ignore some of what he does, to take the long view, to choose your shots? How should the media position itself?
Well, it's a good question. It's something that we're all asking ourselves. In fact, I think it was John Fetterman, your senator here, who said the media can't go into hysterics, and Democrats can't go into hysterics over every little thing Trump says or does, because to a certain degree, even if it's true, it's not like the boy who cried wolf, but to a certain degree you lose your effectiveness and you numb people to what it is. So I don't know the answer to that. You certainly can't ignore it. You have to report it, but maybe, and one of the things I have learned over the years is that the DEFCONs, if you think DEFCON 6 is the highest level, actually it's the lowest level, DEFCON 1 is the highest level. Maybe we need to be at DEFCON 4 or 5 more often and not at 1 or 2. I mean, I do think there is a danger we fall into of, oh my God, this is just outrageous. And at a certain point, people, they become numb to it. It's an interesting thing. There was a column today that I read. I didn't think I was going to be quoting Daniel Patrick Moynihan twice tonight, but he wrote a book called Defining Deviancy Down. And what he was basically saying is that what the country was doing, this was during the Nixon administration, was it was becoming number to things and was less and less outraged about stuff. And that basically what he's saying, you have to define deviancy up so you remain vigilant about things, and you remain shocked and you don't become numb to some of the stuff that Trump's doing in terms of the total lack of experience or even downright opposition of some of his appointments to the departments they're going to be running, and some of the ways he's trying to remove the guardrails. I'll tell you an interesting thing, too, that was suggested. But somehow you can't define deviancy all the way down, but you can't put it all the way up, that everything that's wrong is wrong, and we got to call it out, too. So it's a tough and delicate question. So one of the interesting things that somebody was pointing to, you've got this non-governmental commission. There have been commissions before to try to cut waste and trim things, and it's going to be run by Musk and Ramaswamy, the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. And one of the suggestions somebody had, because the bureaucracy, and there are a lot of protections for civil servants, although there's a Schedule F that they could impose, which would allow them to fire people. One of the easy things they could do is simply demand that everybody go back to work 5 days a week. And some of these departments have moved out of Washington. And I saw the Brandywine thing about creating a hybrid atmosphere where people have a meaningful experience in their office building, but also have some time remote. If you suddenly told government workers who don't have Brandywine building office buildings for them, did you see how I got a plug for the sponsor in here? Come on. Come on. That's not nothing. But in any case, I think a lot of people would say, no, I think I'll find something else to do. Because Washington is really, ghost town's too strong, but it's quite a lot of the downtown offices and, sandwich shops and hair salons and things like that have gone out of business because Washington is still very much on a hybrid and largely remote schedule, which I happen to think is a mistake because it does end up having a tremendous impact on center cities.
We're down to the last couple minutes, 2 last quick questions. I think people in a group like this often wonder, when there's so much distrust, disunion, what can you do? I was listening to Anne Applebaum on the way over here, and Ezra Klein asked her that question, and she said, join something. Join the Rotary, join the Committee of 70, become a poll worker, run for something. Create these bonds in a different way. What are your thoughts on when people say, she said, don't become apathetic. Don't just say that's the way it is. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, no, I think that's a really good advice. And it's interesting. I just read something somebody sent to me that is going to come out, and I don't want to preempt it, but a top official in the Biden administration basically has an essay, and I was honored that he asked me to look at it. And when you read it, you'll say, oh, that's what Chris was talking about. He talks about community, and he talked about the importance of, and he talked about it in a broad sense. He talked about it in a personal sense that, we've got to stop not talking to neighbors who have a Trump or Biden sign on their front yard. He talked about volunteering. He talked about reaching out. He talked about joining something, creating a sense of community. Look, is that going to change the course of this country over the next 2 years or whatever? No, but organizations like this where people join together and don't feel powerless, don't feel apathetic, and feel that there's, in small steps, and maybe it happens here in Philadelphia, and maybe it happens in Harrisburg, and, maybe that affects who the next senator is, or, and it spreads around the country like pollen. that it just gives people a sense of empowerment, which I think is really important. If this election went your way, you feel pretty darn empowered. If it didn't go your way, I think doing something to take some agency, some sense that there is something I can do, is a very constructive answer.
And a question that I'm sure you get, that I've been getting, regardless of how people have voted for him, against him, everywhere I go, people come up to me and say, are we going to be okay? And so your thoughts on that, are we going to be okay?
What do you say?
I say I asked you first.
No, it's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I got to believe in America, and I think, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Am I concerned about what this president could do over the next 4 years? I'm not sure. And over the last 4 years, and particularly, one of the reasons that I wrote this book, part of it was because I just thought the 1960 election was a great story, but one of the other reasons I wrote the book was because I thought there were real parallels between 1960 and 2020 and what Trump has taken us through these last 4 years. And because 1960, it almost turns 2020 on its head. It's an election that I think really may have been stolen. There are two states in particular, Illinois and Texas, which I talked about, rampant vote fraud. And if just those two states had changed, that would have elected Richard Nixon as president in 1960, not John Kennedy. Interestingly enough, Nixon, who is not generally seen as one of the great rule followers and selfless people in American history, was a rule follower and a selfless person, even though he was under a lot of pressure from people in his party to contest the election. That was unthinkable in 1960, and we were at the height of the Cold War. The idea that you would go to the courts and the country, when we're facing Nikita Khrushchev, wasn't going to know who the leader of the free world was. It was unthinkable to Richard Nixon. And so he conceded the election. He met with Kennedy about a week after the election when a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune tried to do an investigation to show the fraud. He shut him down, and when the reporter refused to stop, Nixon called his editors and said, stop it, it's bad for the country. And when on the inaugural stand on January 20th, he was the first person after Nixon was sworn in, Kennedy was sworn in, Nixon was maybe the first or second to come over and shake his hand. He also presided as vice president over the counting of the electoral ballots on January 6th, contrast to 2021. I don't know, but I guess I have faith in the American experiment. And the point I was going to make is we were very fortunate in 2021 that the guardrails held, the center held, and 60 of the 61 courtrooms that heard cases involving Trump found throughout the Trump cases, the only one was a technicality, wasn't anything substantive. And in the end, the vice president on January 6th did the right thing and didn't throw out the ballots or send it back to the states, but certified the election. It wasn't a sure thing that was going to happen. And so if you say to me, are we going to be okay? Is the center going to hold? Are the institutions going to protect us the way they're supposed to? To be continued.
Well, there's a cocktail party after this. And I would suggest you all raise a glass to Richard Nixon. Chris, this was wonderful. If you're a member of the Committee of 70, please come up. We're going to take a picture. But for the rest of you, that cocktail party is downstairs. And again, I want to thank you. It is people like you who participate in our democracy, uphold it, engage others. Please do not stop. Never have you been more needed. So thank you.
Thank you.